The storm had been raging for 3 hours when the knock came. Samuel Sam Cutter sat in his isolated cabin 5 miles outside Dodge City, nursing a glass of whiskey and watching the lightning tear across the Kansas sky through his single window. At 43, Sam had built this life of solitude deliberately. No neighbors, no visitors, no complications. The townspeople called him the loneliest cowboy in Kansas, and he preferred it that way. "Hi, how are you? Sorry to interrupt your story, but what I'm going to ask you is really quick, and it will really help the channel to grow and create new stories. Just click below the video image to subscribe. You'll be doing an act of kindness and encouragement to those who are just starting out. Thank you very much. And continue with your story now." The knock was so soft he almost missed it over the howling wind. Sam's weathered hand moved instinctively to the Colt 45 at his hip. Nobody traveled these roads at night, especially not in weather like this. "Who's there?" Sam called out, his voice cutting through the storm. Silence. Another knock, more desperate this time. Sam approached the heavy wooden door cautiously, his boots creaking against the old floorboards. He'd chosen this isolated spot for a reason, to be left alone with his ghosts and his guilt. Sam unlatched the door and pulled it open, expecting to face some drifter or maybe trouble from his past. Instead, he found himself looking down at a small figure that barely reached his waist. A boy, no more than 8 years old, stood trembling on his doorstep. The child's clothes, a torn cotton shirt and patched trousers, were soaked through, clinging to his thin frame. His bare feet were caked with mud and blood, and his dark hair was plastered against his skull by the relentless rain. But it was the boy's eyes that stopped Sam cold. They were wide with terror, darting constantly over his shoulder as if expecting something terrible to emerge from the darkness. The child's lips moved soundlessly, trying to form words that wouldn't come. "Jesus Christ, boy," Sam muttered, holstering his weapon. "Get in here before you catch your death." The child hesitated, glancing back into the storm one more time before stepping across the threshold. Sam quickly shut the door and threw the heavy latch, noting how the boy flinched at the sound. "What's your name, son?" Sam asked, kneeling to the child's level. The boy opened his mouth, but only managed a strangled whisper. They're coming." A chill ran down Sam's spine that had nothing to do with the storm. He'd heard that tone before. Pure, undiluted fear. "Who's coming? Who are you running from?" But the boy had retreated into himself, wrapping his thin arms around his body and rocking slightly. Sam recognized the signs of deep trauma. He'd seen it in men after particularly brutal encounters. "All right, easy now," Sam said gently, surprising himself with the tenderness in his voice. "You're safe here. Let's get you warmed up first." Sam guided the boy to the fireplace, where dying embers still glowed. He stoked the fire back to life, the flames casting dancing shadows across the cabin's sparse interior. The boy watched the fire with fascination, as if he hadn't seen warmth in days. "When's the last time you ate?" Sam asked, moving to his meager pantry. The boy held up 3 fingers, then 4, uncertainty clouding his features. 3 or 4 days? Sam's jaw tightened. Christ almighty. Sam heated a pot of beef stew over the fire, the rich aroma filling the cabin. As he worked, he studied the boy more carefully. Despite the dirt and fear, there was something refined about the child's features, something that suggested he hadn't always lived rough. "Here," Sam said, offering a bowl of stew and a piece of bread. "Eat slow or you'll make yourself sick." The boy devoured the food with desperate hunger, confirming Sam's suspicion that he'd been on the run for days. As the child ate, Sam noticed something else. A small, intricate mark on the boy's left wrist, partially hidden by his torn sleeve. "That mark on your wrist," Sam said carefully. "How'd you get that?" The boy's spoon clattered into the bowl, and he pulled his sleeve down quickly, shaking his head violently. All right," Sam said, raising his hands. "We don't have to talk about it now." But Sam's mind was racing. He'd seen marks like that before during his darker days. They were brands, signs of ownership used by men who dealt in things that shouldn't be bought or sold. Thunder crashed overhead, and the boy jumped, spilling what remained of his stew. In the brief flash of lightning that followed, Sam saw something that made his blood run cold, fresh bruises around the child's neck, finger-shaped marks that spoke of violence. "Son," Sam said quietly, "what's your name? I need to know what to call you." The boy looked up at him with those haunted eyes and whispered, "Tommy Brennan." "Well, Tommy Brennan, you're safe now. Nobody's going to hurt you while you're under my roof." But even as Sam spoke the words, he wondered if he could keep that promise. The boy's terror was real, and whatever he was running from had left its mark on him. Sam had spent years avoiding other people's problems, but looking at this frightened child, he knew his days of solitude were over. "Tommy," Sam said gently, "I need you to tell me who's after you. I can't protect you if I don't know what we're facing." The boy's eyes filled with tears. "Bad men," he whispered. "They took me from my mama. They said I belong to them now." Sam's hands clenched into fists. He'd suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made his blood boil. "How long ago?" 2 weeks, Tommy said, his voice barely audible. "I ran when they stopped to water their horses. I've been hiding ever since." "And they're still looking for you?" Tommy nodded frantically. "They'll never stop. Mr. Dalton said I was worth too much money to let go." The name hit Sam like a physical blow. Marcus Dalton. He knew that name, knew the kind of man who bore it. If Dalton was involved, this was worse than he'd thought. Much worse. "Tommy," Sam said, his voice steady despite the rage building inside him, "you did good getting away from them, and you did good finding me. But I need you to understand something. This isn't going to be easy. These men you're talking about, they're dangerous." "I know," Tommy whispered, "but I couldn't go back. I couldn't let them. I couldn't—" "You don't have to explain," Sam said quickly. "You're just a boy. This isn't your fault." Outside, the storm was beginning to weaken, but Sam knew the real tempest was just beginning. He'd spent 5 years in this cabin, hiding from his past and the choices that had driven him to solitude. But now, looking at this terrified child, he realized some things were worth fighting for. "Get some rest, Tommy," Sam said, pulling a blanket from his bed. "Tomorrow we're going to figure out how to keep you safe." As the boy curled up by the fire, Sam stood at the window watching the lightning fade. He'd thought his fighting days were over, but Marcus Dalton had just made it personal. And if there was one thing Sam Cutter had never been able to tolerate, it was men who hurt children. The knock in the storm had changed everything. Now Sam had to decide if one scared boy was worth risking the peaceful life he'd built, and his own life in the process. Dawn broke gray and cold over Dodge City, the storm having passed but leaving the air thick with tension. Sam had barely slept, keeping watch by the window while Tommy finally found some peace by the dying fire. As the first light crept through the cabin, Sam knew their sanctuary was temporary. Men like Marcus Dalton didn't give up easily. Tommy stirred as Sam prepared coffee, the boy's eyes immediately darting around the cabin as if remembering where he was. The fear was still there, but something else had emerged overnight. A glimmer of hope. "Morning, son," Sam said quietly. "How'd you sleep?" "Better than I have in weeks," Tommy admitted, sitting up and rubbing his eyes. "Mr. Cutter, are you really going to help me?" Sam poured 2 cups of coffee, adding extra sugar to Tommy's. "I gave you my word, didn't I? But first, I need to know more about what we're dealing with. Tell me about Dalton." Tommy's face darkened. "He runs a business. Takes children from families who can't pay their debts. Says he's collecting what's owed, but really he's—" The boy's voice trailed off. "He's selling them," Sam finished grimly. "I know about Dalton's operation. Used to cross paths with his kind back when I wore a badge." Tommy's eyes widened. "You were a lawman?" "A long time ago," Sam said, his voice heavy with regret. "Before I made some choices that cost me everything I cared about." Before Tommy could ask more questions, the sound of approaching horses cut through the morning air. Sam was at the window instantly, his hand on his gun. 3 riders were approaching the cabin, moving at a steady pace that suggested they weren't in a hurry. They knew their quarry was trapped. "Tommy, get behind the stove and stay down," Sam ordered, his voice sharp with authority. The boy obeyed without question, his face pale with terror. Sam recognized the lead rider immediately. Marcus Dalton himself, a tall man with silver hair and cold blue eyes that had seen too much cruelty. The two men flanking him were hired guns, the kind who killed for money and slept soundly afterward. Dalton reined in his horse 20 yards from the cabin and called out, "Samuel Cutter, I know you're in there, and I know you have something that belongs to me." Sam stepped onto his porch, his Colt .45 clearly visible but not drawn. "Dalton, should have known you'd crawl out from whatever rock you've been hiding under." Now, Sam," Dalton said with a cold smile. "No need for hostility. I'm just here to collect my property and be on my way." "That boy isn't property," Sam said, his voice deadly calm. "He's a child." "He's a debt payment," Dalton corrected. "His mother owed me money she couldn't pay. The boy was offered as collateral and I accepted. It's all perfectly legal." "Legal doesn't make it right." Dalton's smile faded. "You always were too righteous for your own good, Cutter. That's what got you into trouble in Abilene, wasn't it? Couldn't leave well enough alone." Sam's jaw tightened. Dalton was referring to the incident that had ended his career as a lawman, the day he'd tried to stop a corrupt sheriff from selling protection to outlaws and ended up killing 2 men in the process. The territorial government had cleared him of wrongdoing, but the guilt had driven him to this isolated existence. "This isn't about the past," Sam said. "It's about that boy. He's under my protection now." "Your protection?" Dalton laughed, a harsh sound that carried no warmth. "You're one man, Cutter. I have resources you can't imagine. Men who'll do anything for the right price." "Then you'd better hope they're good enough," Sam replied. "Because I'm not giving him up." Dalton's expression hardened. "I was hoping we could settle this like civilized men. The boy is worth $5,000 to me. I'll give you half that to walk away." "Not interested." "Then you're a fool." Dalton gestured to his men. "Jake here used to ride with the younger gang. Bill there has 17 confirmed kills. What do you have, Cutter? A guilty conscience and a death wish?" Sam's hand moved closer to his gun. "I have something you don't, Dalton. A reason to fight." The tension stretched between them like a taut wire. Then Dalton smiled again, but this time it was the smile of a predator who'd found weakness. "You know what I think?" Dalton said conversationally. "I think you've grown soft out here. 5 years of playing hermit, drinking yourself to sleep every night. You're not the same man who cleaned up Abilene." "Maybe not," Sam admitted. "But I'm still the man who put 3 of your associates in the ground when they tried to muscle in on my territory." Dalton's smile faltered slightly. He remembered those men, good killers who'd simply vanished one night. He'd always suspected Cutter was responsible, but he'd never been able to prove it. "Times change, Sam," Dalton said finally. "The boy comes with me, one way or another. You can make this easy or hard, but the outcome's the same. Then I guess we'll do this the hard way." Dalton nodded to his men, and they began to spread out, flanking the cabin. "You have until sunset to reconsider. After that, we come in shooting." With that, the 3 men rode away, but Sam knew they wouldn't go far. They'd set up somewhere with a good view of the cabin and wait. Dalton was right about one thing. Sam was outnumbered and outgunned. Sam went back inside to find Tommy emerging from behind the stove, his face white with fear. "They're going to take me back, aren't they?" the boy whispered. "Not if I can help it," Sam said firmly. "But we need to be smart about this. Dalton's got men and money, but he's also got weaknesses." "What kind of weaknesses?" Sam sat down across from Tommy, his mind already working on a plan. "He's arrogant. Thinks because he's got numbers on his side, he's already won. And he's impatient. Men like Dalton don't like to wait. What are we going to do? First, we're going to get you somewhere safe. Then I'm going to have a conversation with Sheriff Lane." Tommy's eyes widened. "The sheriff? But what if she doesn't believe us?" Sam had been wondering the same thing. Martha Lane was new to Dodge City, appointed just 6 months ago when the previous sheriff had been killed in a gunfight. She was tough and honest, but she was also practical. Would she risk a confrontation with Dalton over one runaway boy? "She'll believe us," Sam said with more confidence than he felt. "But first, we need to get to town without Dalton's men seeing us." Sam moved to a loose floorboard near the back wall and pried it up, revealing a hidden cache of weapons and supplies. He'd prepared for this day, though he'd hoped it would never come. "There's a root cellar behind the cabin," Sam explained, loading a rifle. "It connects to an old mine shaft that comes out about a quarter-mile down the creek. We can use it to get past Dalton's men." Tommy watched with wide eyes as Sam prepared for what was essentially a war. "Mr. Cutter, why are you doing this for me? You don't even know me." Sam paused in his preparations, looking at the boy's earnest face. "Because a long time ago, I failed to protect someone who mattered to me. I won't make that mistake again." The truth was more complicated than that, but Tommy didn't need to know about Sam's daughter, the little girl who died in a cholera outbreak while he was away chasing outlaws. The guilt had eaten at him for years, driving him to this isolated existence. "Are you ready?" Sam asked, shouldering his rifle. Tommy nodded, though his hands were shaking. "What happens if we don't make it to town?" "We'll make it," Sam said firmly. "And once we do, we're going to end this thing once and for all." As they prepared to leave the cabin, Sam took one last look around the place that had been his sanctuary for 5 years. He had a feeling he wouldn't be coming back, but looking at Tommy's frightened but determined face, he realized some things were worth sacrificing everything for. The shadows from his past were closing in, but for the first time in years, Sam Cutter had something worth fighting for. The journey through the abandoned mine shaft took longer than Sam had hoped. The narrow tunnel was partially collapsed in places, forcing them to crawl through spaces barely wide enough for a grown man. Tommy, despite his fear, proved remarkably brave, following Sam's whispered instructions without complaint. They emerged from the creekside exit just as the sun reached its zenith, covered in mud and breathing hard. Sam immediately scanned the surrounding area for Dalton's men, but the landscape appeared empty. Still, he knew they were being watched. "Stay close and keep quiet," Sam whispered to Tommy as they made their way toward the main road to Dodge City. The town came into view after an hour of careful travel, its familiar buildings rising from the Kansas prairie like a mirage. Dodge City in 1887 was still rough around the edges, but it was trying to civilize itself. The days of wild cattle drives and gunfights in the streets were mostly behind it, replaced by a more ordered society that valued law and commerce. Sheriff Martha Lane's office sat on Front Street, a sturdy building that had seen its share of violence over the years. Sam hesitated at the door, knowing that once he walked inside, there would be no going back to his quiet life. "Mr. Cutter?" Tommy looked up at him with trusting eyes. "Are you sure about this?" "No," Sam admitted, "but it's the right thing to do." The bell above the door chimed as they entered. Sheriff Lane looked up from her desk, her sharp green eyes taking in Sam's appearance with professional interest. At 35, Martha Lane was one of the few female sheriffs in Kansas, a position she'd earned through competence and determination rather than politics. "Sam Cutter," she said, leaning back in her chair. "Haven't seen you in town for months. What brings you here?" "This boy," Sam said simply, placing a protective hand on Tommy's shoulder. "His name is Tommy Brennan, and he's in trouble." Sheriff Lane's expression grew serious as she studied the child's frightened face and torn clothing. "What kind of trouble?" Sam quickly explained the situation, watching Lane's face grow darker with each detail. When he mentioned Marcus Dalton's name, her jaw tightened visibly. "Dalton," she said with disgust. "I've heard rumors about his operation, but never had enough evidence to move against him." "Well, now you do," Sam said. "Tommy here is living proof of what Dalton's been doing." Sheriff Lane stood and walked around her desk, kneeling in front of Tommy. "Son, I need you to tell me exactly what happened. Can you do that?" Tommy nodded, his voice growing stronger as he recounted his ordeal. He told her about his mother's debts, about being taken from their small farm outside Wichita, about the other children he'd seen in Dalton's custody. With each word, Sheriff Lane's expression grew more grim. "This is serious," she said finally, standing up. "If what you're saying is true, Dalton's running a slave operation. That's a federal crime." "It's true," Sam said, "and Dalton's not going to give up easily. He's got men watching my place right now, waiting for us to come back." Before Sheriff Lane could respond, the office door burst open. Mayor Harrison Caldwell strode in, his face flushed with anger. Behind him came Dr. William Hayes, the town's most prominent physician, and banker Charles Morrison. The three men formed the unofficial power structure of Dodge City. "Martha," Caldwell said without preamble, "we need to talk." "I'm in the middle of something, Harrison," Sheriff Lane replied coolly. "Yes, I know, and that's exactly what we need to discuss." Caldwell's eyes fixed on Sam with obvious distaste. "Mr. Cutter, I understand you've brought some rather serious accusations against a respected businessman." Sam's eyes narrowed. "Respected? Dalton's a child trafficker." "That's a very serious charge," Dr. Hayes interjected smoothly. "Do you have any proof beyond the word of a frightened child?" "The boy's testimony is proof enough," Sam shot back. Banker Morrison stepped forward, his expensive suit and gold watch marking him as a man of means. "Mr. Cutter, I think you may not understand the full situation here. Mr. Dalton has significant business interests in this region. He's invested heavily in our community." "What kind of investments?" Sheriff Lane asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. The three men exchanged glances. "The kind that bring prosperity to Dodge City," Caldwell said carefully. "The kind we can't afford to jeopardize based on unsubstantiated claims." Sam felt his temper rising. "So you're willing to look the other way while children are bought and sold?" "No one's saying that," Dr. Hayes said quickly. "But we must be careful not to make accusations we can't prove. Mr. Dalton has assured us that this is simply a matter of debt collection." "Debt collection?" Sam's voice was incredulous. "The boy is 8 years old!" "The boy's mother signed a legal document," Morrison said, producing a paper from his coat. "She put up her son as collateral for a loan. When she defaulted, Mr. Dalton was within his rights to collect." Sheriff Lane took the document and examined it carefully. Her frown deepened as she read. "This appears to be legitimate," she said reluctantly. "It's a fraud," Sam said firmly. "No mother would willingly sign away her child. Desperate people do desperate things," Caldwell said with false sympathy. The woman was facing foreclosure. Mr. Dalton offered her a way out. Tommy had been listening to this exchange with growing horror. Now he stepped forward, his young voice cutting through the adult conversation like a knife. "My mama can't read," he said simply. "She never learned how. She wouldn't have known what she was signing." The room fell silent. Sheriff Lane looked down at the document again, then at the three men who'd brought it. "If Mrs. Brennan is illiterate," she said slowly, "then this contract is invalid. She couldn't have given informed consent." That's a technicality?" Morrison stammered. "It's the law," Sheriff Lane replied firmly. "And even if it weren't, I won't stand by while children are treated like property in my jurisdiction." Mayor Caldwell's face reddened. "Martha, I'm warning you. Don't let your emotions cloud your judgment. This town needs Mr. Dalton's business." "What this town needs," Sheriff Lane said, standing up to her full height, "is to remember what's right and what's wrong." The confrontation was interrupted by the sound of horses outside. Through the window, Sam could see Marcus Dalton himself riding up to the sheriff's office, flanked by his two gunmen. The man's timing was impeccable and suspicious. "Looks like your business partner is here," Sam said to the three town leaders. Dalton entered without knocking, his cold eyes surveying the room before settling on Tommy. "There you are, boy. You've caused me quite a bit of trouble." "Mr. Dalton," Sheriff Lane said formally, "you're under arrest for child trafficking and conspiracy." Dalton laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "I think not, Sheriff. As you can see, I have a legal document giving me custody of the boy." "A fraudulent document," Sheriff Lane corrected. "The boy's mother is illiterate." "Prove it," Dalton said with a smile. "Mrs. Brennan is dead, killed in a farming accident just last week. Quite tragic, really." The words hit Tommy like a physical blow. He staggered, his face going white with shock and grief. Sam caught him before he could fall, his own anger burning white-hot. "You bastard!" Sam growled. Now, Dalton said mildly. "Accidents happen. The point is there's no one left to contest the document's validity." Sheriff Lane's hand moved to her gun. "Get out of my office, Dalton." "I don't think so," Dalton replied. He gestured, and his two gunmen stepped forward. "You see, Sheriff, I have friends in this town, important friends who understand the value of cooperation." Mayor Caldwell cleared his throat nervously. "Martha, perhaps we should reconsider—" "No," Sheriff Lane said firmly. "I don't care how much money this man has invested in our town. I won't let him take this child." "Then you'll force me to take more direct action," Dalton said. His smile never wavered, but his eyes were as cold as winter. "It would be unfortunate if something happened to you, Sheriff, or to Mr. Cutter here. Accidents, you understand?" The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Sam could see the fear in the faces of the three town leaders, could sense their willingness to sacrifice Tommy to protect their own interests. But he could also see the determination in Sheriff Lane's eyes. She was outnumbered and outgunned, but she wasn't backing down. "Tommy," Sam said quietly, never taking his eyes off Dalton, "remember what I told you about being brave?" The boy nodded, tears streaming down his face for his dead mother. "Good," Sam said, "because we're about to find out what this town is really made of." The confrontation was reaching its breaking point, and Sam knew that whatever happened next would determine not just Tommy's fate, but the soul of Dodge City itself. The tension in Sheriff Lane's office was thick enough to cut with a knife. Dalton's gunmen had their hands resting casually on their weapons, while the three town leaders shifted nervously, clearly regretting their involvement. Tommy pressed closer to Sam, still reeling from the news of his mother's death. "You have 1 minute to decide, Sheriff," Dalton said, checking his pocket watch with theatrical precision. "Hand over the boy, or face the consequences." Sheriff Lane's green eyes blazed with determination. "The only consequence here will be you spending the rest of your life in prison, Dalton." "I think not," Dalton replied smoothly. "You see, I've taken the liberty of ensuring that any resistance would be futile." As if on cue, the sound of multiple horses could be heard outside. Through the window, Sam counted at least 6 more armed men taking positions around the sheriff's office. Dalton had come prepared for war. "You're surrounded," Dalton continued. "My men have orders to shoot anyone who tries to leave this building with the boy." Mayor Caldwell stepped forward, his face pale with fear. "This has gone too far, Dalton. We agreed to look the other way, not to participate in a siege. Sometimes business requires decisive action," Dalton said coldly. "Don't worry, Mayor. Once this is resolved, everything will return to normal." Sam studied the situation carefully. They were outnumbered at least 4 to 1, trapped in a building with limited exits. But he'd been in worse situations before, and he'd learned that sometimes the best weapon was information. "Tell me something, Dalton," Sam said conversationally. "How long have you been paying off these 3? The question caught everyone off guard. Dr. Hayes sputtered in protest, but Sam continued. "See, I've been thinking about the timing. You show up here just minutes after we arrive with a convenient legal document and a story about Tommy's mother dying in an accident. That suggests you've been watching us, which means you have people in town feeding you information." Sheriff Lane's eyes narrowed as she looked at the 3 town leaders. "Is that true?" "Of course not," Morrison said quickly, but sweat was beading on his forehead. "Really?" Sam pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket, a telegram he'd found in Dalton's saddlebags during a previous encounter years ago. "Because I happen to know that Dalton's been using the Dodge City Telegraph office to coordinate his operations. Someone's been sending him regular reports." It was a bluff, but a calculated one. Sam watched the 3 men's faces carefully, looking for tells. Dr. Hayes remained composed, but Morrison's eyes darted nervously toward the door. "Charles," Sheriff Lane said quietly, "is there something you want to tell me?" The banker's resolve crumbled. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he said desperately. "Dalton said he was just collecting legitimate debts. He offered to invest in the bank, help us expand. I never knew about the children." "But you suspected," Sam pressed. "And you chose to look the other way because the money was too good to pass up." "That's enough," Dalton snapped, his composure finally cracking. "Morrison, keep your mouth shut." But the damage was done. Sheriff Lane now had confirmation of the conspiracy, and her anger was palpable. "Jake, Bill," Dalton called to his gunmen. "Take the boy. Kill anyone who tries to stop you." The two men drew their weapons, but they'd underestimated their opponents. Sheriff Lane was faster than either of them expected, her Colt clearing leather in a smooth motion that spoke of years of practice. Her first shot took Jake in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his gun flying. Sam moved simultaneously, diving behind the sheriff's desk and pulling Tommy with him. His own weapon was in his hand before Bill could bring his gun to bear, and his shot was true. The gunman dropped with a cry of pain, clutching his wounded leg. "Nobody else has to get hurt," Sheriff Lane announced, her gun now trained on Dalton. "Call off your men." Dalton's face was a mask of fury, but he was a pragmatist above all else. "Stand down," he called through the window. "We're negotiating." "No negotiation," Sheriff Lane said firmly. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, child trafficking, and attempted murder." "You can't prove any of that in court," Dalton snarled. "Actually, I can," said a new voice from the doorway. Everyone turned to see a woman in her 30s standing in the entrance, flanked by two federal marshals. She was well-dressed but travel-worn, with the determined look of someone who'd ridden hard to get here. "Who are you?" Dalton demanded. "Deputy U.S. Marshal Sarah Brennan," the woman replied. "Tommy's aunt." Tommy's eyes widened in shock and joy. "Aunt Sarah? But how did you—" "I've been tracking Dalton's operation for months," she explained, never taking her eyes off the criminal. "When I heard about what happened to my sister, I knew Tommy would try to escape. I've been following his trail for days." Sam felt a mixture of relief and something else. Disappointment? He'd grown attached to the boy in their short time together, had begun to imagine what it might be like to have someone to care for again. "This changes nothing," Dalton said desperately. "I have legal documents." "Forged documents," Marshal Brennan corrected. "We've been investigating your operation, Dalton. We know about the fake contracts, the murdered parents, the children you've sold. It's over." The sound of more horses outside made everyone tense, but these were federal marshals, not Dalton's men. The criminal's private army was being systematically disarmed and arrested. "You have the right to remain silent," Sheriff Lane said, producing handcuffs. "Though I doubt you'll use it." As Dalton was led away in chains, his composure finally broke completely. "This isn't over," he screamed. "I have connections, money, influence. I'll be out in a week." "Not where you're going," Marshal Brennan said calmly. "Federal prison doesn't care about your local connections." With Dalton and his men in custody, the immediate danger was over. Tommy ran to his aunt, who swept him up in a fierce embrace. "I thought I'd lost you forever," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Aunt Sarah," Tommy said, pulling back to look at her. "This is Mr. Cutter. He saved me. He kept me safe when I had nowhere else to go." Marshal Brennan turned to Sam, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I can't thank you enough. When I heard what you'd done, risking your life for a child you barely knew, anyone would have done the same," Sam said quietly. "No," she replied firmly. "They wouldn't. Most people would have turned him away or handed him over to avoid trouble. You chose to fight." Sheriff Lane approached, holstering her weapon. "What happens now?" "Tommy comes with me," Marshal Brennan said. "I'm his legal guardian now, and I have a ranch in Colorado where he'll be safe. As for Dalton's operation, we'll be shutting down his entire network. There are dozens of children to be rescued and returned to their families." "And the town leaders who helped him?" Sam asked, looking at Morrison Caldwell and Dr. Hayes. "They'll face charges," Sheriff Lane said grimly. "Conspiracy, accessory to kidnapping, corruption. They'll have their day in court." As the cleanup continued around them, Tommy approached Sam one last time. "Mr. Cutter," the boy said, his voice small but determined. "Will I see you again?" Sam knelt down to the boy's level, his throat tight with emotion. "I hope so, son. You know where to find me. Will you visit sometime?" "Aunt Sarah says I can have visitors." Sam looked at Marshal Brennan, who nodded encouragingly. "I'd like that very much, Tommy." As the federal marshals prepared to leave with Tommy and the prisoners, Sheriff Lane approached Sam. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "this town could use a deputy sheriff, someone with experience, someone who knows right from wrong." Sam considered the offer. His quiet life of solitude suddenly seemed less appealing than it had a few days ago. "I'll think about it," he said. "Don't think too long," she replied with a smile. "Good men are hard to find." As the sun set over Dodge City, Sam stood on the steps of the sheriff's office, watching the wagon carrying Tommy disappear into the distance. The boy turned back one last time, waving enthusiastically, and Sam waved back. For the first time in 5 years, Samuel Cutter felt like he had a purpose again. The knock in the storm had changed everything, just as he'd known it would. But instead of bringing destruction, it had brought redemption. The dead of night had indeed given way to a dawn that exposed long-buried secrets. And in facing those secrets, Sam had discovered that even the hardest men could choose hope over history. As he walked back toward his cabin, no longer a refuge but a home he might soon leave behind, Sam smiled. Tomorrow he would ride to Colorado to visit a brave boy who had reminded him what it meant to fight for something worthwhile. The cowboy had never expected visitors, much less a terrified child in the dead of night. But sometimes the most unexpected encounters change everything, leading not to an ending, but to a new beginning filled with hope, purpose, and the promise of a better tomorrow. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much, and come back often.